When we hear the term science fiction, we immediately think of blockbusters such as Blade Runner, Star Wars, Jurassic Park, and Avatar, just to name a few. Generally, when we think about the science fiction genre, we tend to relate it to movies that are filled with robots, spaceships, alien life forms, and even intricate visual and special effects. These are the hallmarks for this genre that hold true from the beginning of film history. I mean, just take a look at Méliès's Trip to the Moon. This 1902 film shows us alien life forms and space travel. In what is considered the first science fiction film, Méliès established many of the themes that are still recurrent today, and he even made use of innovative special effects. In this clip, you can clearly see funny little men dressed in alien suits. This is the first time that we're introduced to these types of characters in film. However, it is not always fair to generalize and say that all science fiction films must include aliens, special effects, and all these tropes that I mentioned before. After all, as the name implies, science fiction is simply a story based on imagined future scientific or technological advances. To tell a science fiction story, you must not solely rely on visuals and intricate, elaborate, faraway destinations. To tell a science fiction story, you simply need to tell it. That is the case of La Jetée. La Jetée is a 1962 30-minute short science fiction film directed by Chris Marker, and it does exactly this. It simply tells us a story. In fact, the story in La Jetée is not even told in moving pictures. It is constructed entirely of still photos. This incredible photo montage is guided by its soundtrack, which is largely composed of commentary from a narrator. This narrator comes to our rescue by helping us fill the gaps and cure emotional involvement so that we may reanimate the science fiction story.
La surface de Paris.
In his film, Marker tells us a story of time travel, but he does this without the use of special effects or time machines or any sort of prop. Instead, he offers a clear narrative that is reliant on the still visuals. Proving to be accessible yet confounding at the same time, Marker's film is a truly terrific example of unique visual storytelling, relying purely on narrative and visuals to some extent. 6 years later, the introduction of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey broke through all previously conceived notions of science fiction films. It introduced earth-shattering visual effects and a realistic perception of space travel, spaceships, and all sorts of props included. In 1968, Space Odyssey had a philosophical scope that earlier films had not attempted. Like La Jetée, it relies solely on visuals, but in this film, the visuals are heavily embedded with special effects and all sorts of intricacies. In this film, as opposed to La Jetée, the script is very minimal. In it by itself, this minimal writing style emphasizes the idea of the visuals as the main attraction in this movie. As a result, the film is purely just a visual indulgence, providing the viewer a visual rather than logical experience. Despite having a $10.5 million budget and just short of 3 hours of screen time, Kubrick's film managed to receive only one Academy Award for nothing else but special effects. For this reason, when Neil Armstrong left his footprint on the moon a year later, people thought creative genius Kubrick had staged it. 11 years later, in 1979, Andrei Tarkovsky and his film Stalker took the science fiction genre to a deeper, more intellectual approach. The film is void of decadence and distraction. Unlike Space Odyssey, Stalker has little use of lavish hallmarks like robots and spaceships. In fact, the film seems to have no visual effects other than the changing colors from the beginning of the film, which is monochrome, into color once they enter the supernatural world of the zone. So, in the end, if there's one thing we learn from all this, is that following guidelines and tropes isn't necessarily the best way to get a story across. Experimenting with form gives us an infinite amount of ways in which we can create a uniquely compelling picture that truly speaks the vision of the director.